Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Eckmann of Gold Derby here with Alexa Fogel, casting director for Feud, Capote versus the Swans. And I don't know if you took this in, but when this project was announced with this lineup of incredible women as the Swans, I feel like excitement kind of went through the roof online. And how many of those women were already, firmly in mind at the start of the project, and what were the conversations like to fill the rest of the roles?
Uh, I mean, I was on this project for a long time. Um, I think only one. I mean, Dave was the only person who was cast
Hmm.
in the very beginning, and it was a long process, and in some ways, I would say sort of methodical because we were creating, this putting together this puzzle, this tapestry. Uh, so we really did go bit by bit. I mean, I will say that in the beginning, the most important part of that puzzle was Truman. So the women obviously are hugely important, and we were doing that piece by piece. I think I do have notes because it was a long time ago. So in terms of the timeline, so I think that we really started with Slim and Lee, and then sort of built it out from there. CZ, and but Truman was really my focus in the beginning. I mean, that's where I
Hmm.
was really spending an enormous amount of time as I was building the women, going over lists with Ryan, setting up Zooms with him, doing all of that.
Yeah, and Truman is a character who we've seen other actors embody this before on screen. So when you're thinking about this version of Truman, what was it that about Tom Hollander, that made him right for this new version of him?
Well, it's a different period in Truman's life, so it's well past that moment of glory that he's had. And I think also the way that Robbie wrote it, and in the end, the way Gus directed it, you're going in and out of so much of a spiral. It's the friendships, the manipulation, the self-destruction. There's so much that's different in terms of the other portrayals. I really didn't think of it at all in the same way. I mean, some of that is iconic, and of course, you're up against that. But it's such a different character, and I think that I mean, I knew Tom's work very well, and it is there's a scene where he takes Elizabeth Debicki down in The Night Manager that is just really astonishing. And I think that's the scene that I sent to Ryan because it's just an acting masterclass. And I think that I don't know if Ryan ever watched it, to be honest. He knew his work very well, honestly. Uh, and I think for me that is the thing that is such a great example of how he can do almost anything.
Yeah. I think I probably saw Tom on stage before I saw him on screen. And I think in many
I
of your projects, you have a deep well, I think, of theater actors, especially New York theater actors that I feel like always show up in your work. Is that a conscious choice there? Do you have a whole, you know,
I mean, it's where I
favorite well?
started and I live there. So, I think that, people do a lot of different things and do them well. And so uh, I think it's just a natural progression. It's not, I think the other thing about the projects that I've done with Ryan and some of the things I've done with David Simon, and I've talked about this before, so forgive me if I sound like I'm repeating myself. When you do things that need a certain kind of verbal dexterity, you end up with theater actors without really intending it, or sometimes you end up with musicians or rappers. You end up with people who really can do that, whether it's something that feels like they've done Noel Coward or Shakespeare or rappers, whatever it is, you need a certain kind of facility. And I think that, you know, theater actors are very good at that.
Yeah. I would think with this specific project too, thinking about the Swans and Truman together, there's a kind of energy and chemistry of this particular time period too that feels so essential to it, which to me feels like kind of this intangible element. So how do you assess that when you're thinking about who would be right for these women?
I mean, that's the fun of anything you do, isn't it? I mean, trying to figure out what the period or the place is, what is specific about it. And, I obviously I wasn't in New York then, but I do remember some of those sort of certain things about, growing up and things that I did actually go to Sarah Lawrence with Lee Radziwill's daughter. And those days when everybody went to the country club and smoked and drank and when they were pregnant. I mean, there are things that you sort of remember from being very, very young in those periods, and all the things that you can sort of look up that feel weirdly romantic, even though they wouldn't be now. I think it really doesn't matter what it is, whether it's something about, basketball or Baltimore, and drug dealers and cops, whatever it is, you're just trying to honor that world. And I think in terms of your actual question, which is who would serve that, I mean, I think that Brian is also so good at casting that it's fun to do this kind of thing with him in terms of what are the particular characteristics of each of these women. CZ has a certain kind of empathy. Slim has a certain kind of toughness, and all of these actresses are so good. And it's just recognizing what can come to the surface and how it will go together.
Yeah. I like something I like about it, going off of what you just said, is that you said like CZ has empathy, and I think Chloe always plays, not always, but oftentimes gets cast as characters with that deep empathetic core. But oftentimes she's playing a more gritty character, like I'm thinking of Bloodline, and it's really fun to see her as this more affected, mannered woman. What is it like, kind of thinking about someone against type maybe, and putting them in a new world?
I mean, that's the joy of the job, right? Because I know that actors have all of these muscles and can do lots of different things. I mean, in her case, I do remember that we sent pictures. She had recently gotten married when we were casting this, and her wedding was in Greenwich, and she had the most beautiful clothes, and it just felt an additional way to sort of explain how she could come from a world, move into a world, as opposed to, a perception of her from, the early work.
Yeah.
Um, but it's what's exciting about the job is, you know, letting people see a different side of what an actor can do.
Yeah. Another person, who's a great addition, was more of an unknown at the time, was Ella Beatty, who was fit in just perfectly to the show. What is it like kind of giving, knowing that you're going to give someone their first major television gig or film gig?
I mean, it's the best. They get out of school, they come in an audition, they're very, very good, and in her case, certainly comes from very good stock. Um, I just saw her in Appropriate on Broadway. She is
Yeah.
so good. Uh, and she was wonderful in the piece, and certainly had to play with some pretty heavy hitters in the scene she was in. So very impressive debut. It's
Yeah.
great. I mean, it's a thrill.
And I know, actors often audition for a casting director many, many times, sometimes before they get a role. What can you talk about that kind of relationship of like what that experience is of watching someone maybe grow over a really long period of time?
Yeah, and also may audition over a long period of time and may um, do various jobs over an entire career. I mean, John Bedford Lloyd was in, I think, the second and was it the second and third or the third and fourth seasons of Ozark? And I've known John, and when he auditioned for Ozark, I've known him for so long since I was casting regional theater in my 20s that he was telling me about his most recent grandchild.
Wow.
So, these relationships are the long game, and I think that is also something, it's so hard for actors who are getting out of school or just moving to New York or LA and starting out to remember that that's what that is the relationship. It's meant to go on for a very, very long time. And as actors change, we see those changes and want to, want them to be in other things as they evolve.
And you really have introduced, I think, a whole mess of actors to the world with, if you think back to shows like Ozark and Pose and The Wire, things like that. What is, what does that feel like knowing that you're going to kind of like push someone to
I
the
mean, you don't
forefront?
really think about that, to be honest.
Mm.
You guys think about that. I mean, I think we just think about trying to get the best assemblage that makes the most sense. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day because I don't know why I was thinking about it. Somebody must have asked me a question, and I realized how many times it was one additional time, how many times I actually had cast Tom Pelfrey because I'd forgotten about one. Uh, so I think it was four rather than three. Um, there was a job I'd forgotten about because I know what it was because I was talking about Generation Kill, and that was his first audition for me, and maybe one of his first auditions after getting out of graduate school at Rutgers. So these relationships really do go on for a long time. I mean, when you think about it, if somebody asks you the question, it's great, but it's also um, it's just what you do.
Yeah. Yeah. Not what's thought about in the moment, perhaps. Uh, this show also, there's newcomers like Ella, and then there's someone like Treat Williams, who it is actually his last on-screen appearance, and he has such great work with Naomi Watts in this. Their dynamic is really fascinating to watch play out.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I'm really
What?
proud. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm
No,
really
no.
proud of the men that ended up in this. Um, I think, and I will say honestly, for me, the three most difficult roles were Truman, uh, Bill Paley, and James Baldwin. Uh, I mean, Truman for the most obvious reasons. Bill Paley because he was a media titan. He was a well-known figure uh, who I knew about before I moved to New York and when I went to college. He was a physically big man, um, and whoever we cast was going to have to play opposite this incredible actress who's the lead. So that narrows the list enormously. And I thought he was so good, and it is completely a tragic loss that this was his last job. I suppose the only thing that there's no silver lining, but it is good to know that he loved the job and that everyone enjoyed him so much and that he was so good in it. And James Baldwin, um, a lot of people didn't even want to consider it because he's so iconic. He's so important to his community. And I think that ended up being really special. But Chris Chalk did a beautiful job.
Yes, absolutely. Does that change the kind of process your thought process when it is casting a figure, a real life figure who is very well known? Like, how does that complicate things?
It can be a little terrifying. I mean, that's a really, you have to get that right. I mean, look, you have to get it right, not just in terms of, I don't mean just in terms of thinking about history, but it's also about what's on the page. It's about what Robbie wrote and how it's going to be approached. And, in that case, it just so happens that is something that Chris, who is, established and wonderful actor, had always wanted to play and was willing to come in and play around with the material with me, with what I had at the time. Um, but some of that is just luck that an actor at that level was interested and willing to give it a go.
Yeah. This is just the latest in several collaborations you have with Ryan Murphy. And when I was looking back at the shows you've done with him, there's just something interesting that when the cast is announced for one of his shows and the shows that you've worked on together, and they put out, the key art or something, or even before that, it's like the world is kind of built already, just with the casting announcement. There's such a clear vision of what we're about to see as the audience. Is that something you think about? Why do you think there is such that clear
I
vision
think
behind
Ryan
it?
is, Ryan is very good at casting, but he's also very good at casting me in the right thing for us to do together. If you think about the amount of things that he does, I haven't actually done very many of them. I think I've done four. Um, but he knows the ones that are right for us together. He knows the ones that are going to be. I mean, he couldn't have known this in the beginning because the first one was Pose, um, but he did, or it worked out that way. The worlds that are incredibly interesting to the two of us that we'll work on together in the right way. I mean, there's nothing about this in a 3 sentence description that I would have not been dying to do. Working with Robbie, working with Gus, this time period in New York, Truman, Capote, all of it. It's just too, and it's a gigantic amount of people, which is something I enjoy. Um, but I think I don't know about, we just sort of build it and build it and build it and build it, and then it's eventually done. Uh, he's tremendous when it comes to this part of. I mean, he's good at all of it, but my part of it, he's very good at.
Well, it's fantastic work on this season of Feud, Capote versus the Swans. So thank you so much, Alexa, for joining me and sitting down discussing Truman and the Swans.
Thank you. This is fun.